How has global tax policy changed over the past 250 years?
Well, actually, taxation has become a thing, right? So it's become the main source of government revenue everywhere almost. So for us, it's something, if you live in the UK, in Germany, in Portugal, right? Anywhere in developed democracies, it's the thing, right? So for you, nothing is as certain as taxes and death, right? Citizens don't even think about paying their taxes very often, right? It's a very natural system and it feels as if this is how, the natural state of the world. But when you think about it historically and also geographically, it's actually very unique, right? For a very long time, taxes didn't play a big role, right? They were very low. They might not even have existed. Governments finance themselves by, raiding, selling crown jewels, right? So, having monopolies on tobacco or vodka or things like this, right? So this was actually a relatively new, taxes have always existed, but this modern tax state as we understand it, right? So a state that mainly finances itself through sort of what we call modern tax instruments, right? Like the income tax, for instance, or value-added taxes. And this has spread everywhere around the globe. So these taxes are now a reality for governments all over the world, and almost all governments finance themselves mainly via these taxes.
I see. And so, if we go back further enough in history, was the reason that we didn't have taxes because it would have been an ineffective mechanism? We lived in an age where there wasn't the communications metrics that we had and the technology that we had to be able to administer them. Maybe nations didn't see them necessarily themselves in the same way, in the way that we currently do. Or was it simply that if you go back far enough, all the wealth was basically held by the king or queen of the region, and ultimately there wasn't a lot to tax anyway?
Yeah, it's all of this, right? So when you think about this, both governments and citizens weren't able to be taxpayers or, tax lords, let's say, right? So for a very long time, nation states didn't even exist, right? That's a bit different in the UK, but in many parts of the world, this doesn't exist. And kings or rulers had almost no information about their citizens, so they started out tax farming. So this gave power to local lords, accountants to tax the citizens and give, they were auctioning off the rights to be a tax farmer, right? Um, so what you would do is local individuals or lords would bid for these rights to be tax farmers, right? The highest bid would be taken. So this is what the ruler got at the national level. And they could keep everything else that they could tax from the population, right? So that, of course, meant a relatively coercive, violent taxman that was hated everywhere. But that was the only way. So this is happening in France, in the UK, everywhere because the information was just not there for the central government to know who had how much money where. And if you think about the other side of the taxpayers themselves, right? For a very long time, economic growth was, not really existent. We lived in subsistence economies. So most people had no money, they had no wealth, they had no income, they had nothing to be taxed, right? So what they had was their labor. So this is when we had forced labor, indentured services. We also had that in Europe. We not only have that as form of slavery, um, then later as a colonial practice, but we also had that in everywhere in the European continent. And so this is what you could see as a form of taxation, but not the way that we see it as modern taxes, where you are living in a formal monetized economy. You know how much money you make. The government knows how much money you make. Very often, your employer is actually the one who is taxing you, right? And already giving part of your income to the government. Mm.
Sure,
This is a very modern state of the world.
sure. And if you wouldn't mind sort of commenting on this, Philip, obviously I think the obvious thing that we could mention is that just the volume of taxation has increased over the past significantly, just in terms of percentages. But has there been any other sort of nuances in terms of how tax policy has changed over time in regards to the type of policy? So we mentioned overall taxation there, but potentially a mix of income versus asset taxes or wealth taxes, administration. Has there been any other differences over time that we've noticed?
Yes, of course, the tax mix has changed first um, from traditional to modern taxes. So, traditional taxes were narrow had a narrow base and were not ad valorem. So they taxed units like, number of windows of a house, for instance. And
Yes.
in or it they went to bottlenecks of economic activity, bridges, roads, customs posts. And what modern taxes introduced was broad-based taxation, taxes that tapped into macroeconomic tax bases as a whole, all of wealth, all of income, all of consumption. And the first modern taxes to emerge were really wealth taxes, asset taxes, because they were still clearly linked to observable bases like land. So the first modern tax really to emerge was the inheritance tax, introduced in Austria in 1759 to fund the debt from the Seven Years' War. And then, slowly, the inheritance tax spread over the 19th century. For instance, after decolonization in Latin America, the new states of Colombia, Venezuela, etc., they introduced inheritance taxes in the 1820s to make it up for the colonial transfers that used to come from Latin America, from southern Latin America, and no longer um, came. So the first step was really asset-based taxation, and then at around the turn of the century, from the 18th to the 19th century, income taxation made their entry and spread from the 1920s massively. So the personal income tax charged on individuals, and the corporate income tax charged on legal persons. And then after the First World War, consumption taxes made an entry, first in France and Germany, because inflation ate into income tax revenues, and consumption taxation allowed to get at tax revenues more quickly. And today, taxation in the global north is very much focused on income, personal income, personal income tax, also social security contributions. In global south countries, Asia, Africa, Latin America, it's mostly the corporate income tax, so easy to tax, and consumption taxes. And in very few resource economies like the United Arab Emirates, it's mostly non-tax revenues.
Hmm. So you bring up an interesting point there, that even in the modern day, there is actually quite a lot of nuance between countries around the world, whether developing, more westernized, poorer countries, in regards to the main source of taxation and their actual taxation mix and models that they implement. And this obviously feeds into the research that you guys conducted. I was hoping you could just briefly outline for me the research objectives that you were trying to achieve with this research paper.
So so it's not only a paper; it's several papers in the book because this really was a relatively long-term research that we did there. We started out a bit naive, I think, thinking that it would be easy to gather the data, and then it took much longer, and so we had to get money for doing it. So I think what we saw in the literature was a very strong focus on Europe and on OECD countries. So let's say the West or the global North. Also, when it comes to the development of what we call the historical tax state, which we found very interesting, and we wanted to learn more about this. But it was very hard to actually do this because all the data that you had was mainly on 10, 18, 20 Western countries. And there was just simply no information at all for the rest of the world. And, may I remind you, the rest of the world, that's actually where 80% of the world population lives nowadays. So we basically had no clue. So we wanted to try to figure out more and then tell, let's say a history of the modern state development via taxation. as a final objective, I guess. But in order to do that, we actually first needed to put a lot of money and effort into gathering data because there just simply was no data whatsoever. So, at the moment, most economists, political economists, they are interested in telling causal stories. Right? But our first objective was not getting to any causal story or even correlational story whatsoever, but it was really to just describe the state of the world because we just didn't know. So we spent, what, 5 to 7 years, Philip, gathering data on these introductions. And this is just the year and then some information around this of 6 modern taxes. So the inheritance tax, personal and corporate income taxes, social security contributions, um, general consumption taxes, and then later the value added tax for 220 jurisdictions, past and present worldwide, starting in 1750 till today. And we gathered information from archives, from old books, from secondary sources, to find out when these taxes were first introduced in which jurisdiction, or if they were introduced at all, and under which circumstances. And this is basically what we've done. And then the first objective was to map out this global development, who introduced what type of tax, when, and where.
Yes, we focused on tax introductions because that's the most basic entry point into developing tax capacity. If you don't have a tax on the books, you can't tax anything. Of course, not all taxes are actually used. If you look at social security contributions in the global south, for instance, usually countries have them, but they raise very, very little revenue. And therefore, people were asking us, well, now you have this data on tax introductions. Could we also please have the data on tax revenues? But I can tell you, even the information on tax introductions was extremely hard to get for a lot of countries, especially in sub Saharan Africa. Finding information on tax revenue is almost impossible.
Right. And just to, as like a clarifying point from my perspective there, when you talk about tax introductions, are you talking about the rates and the policies that were implemented at certain periods of time as opposed to the actual revenues that are being generated by those tax policies? Because I can imagine, particularly in less developed countries where you don't have a bureaucratic infrastructure for collecting data and also, quite honestly, administering the taxes that you have come into policy, it would be very hard to, one, actually collect the taxes to begin with and actually sort of, gain the revenues that you intended, and two, actually get appropriate data on how much taxes you're actually collecting, to what extent and to what degree, and how much is actually affecting. Is that what you mean by the tax introductions there?
Exactly.
Yes, the introduction of a new tax, we also tried to code the tax rate at introduction. We also have a dummy on whether the same tax was introduced at the subnational level before anything else we coded. Well, we have a qualitative comment section where we give background information, historical information, or also technical information on the context in which the new tax was introduced.
And we also have the sources, of course, right? So if someone is interested, you can always go back there. So the job of this qualitative section was to, if we find more information, we also wanted to provide it. But for the reason you just said, it's so hard to find this comparatively for everyone, so for all countries and for all taxes, that it was just not feasible to do this in a more quantifiable manner, right? So we have this information for some countries and taxes, but not for all.
Sure. And actually, on that point, there was something I picked up when I was reading through the sort of mix of quantitative and qualitative measures that were implemented within the work that you were doing. I was curious, how do you balance the mix between using quantitative and qualitative methods when gathering data for research purposes? Obviously, I think we have a tendency, particularly in economics, but in honestly in business and other fields, to sort of rely on the quantitative a lot of the time, even if at particular points data can be misleading if you draw the incorrect conclusions from it or inaccurate conclusions from it. But at the same time, qualitative data is a little bit more anecdotal a lot of times in the way things are implemented. And so I was curious as to how you balance particularly if you're mixing the two, how you balance the ability to obtain that data and making sure it's a reliable thing that you can draw conclusions from.
You need the qualitative information in order to get reliable quantitative data.
Hmm.
You know, and see, nowadays it's very easy to decide whether a tax is an, let's say, income tax or not. But in the early days, when the tax was invented, there was no notion of what a standard income tax had to look like. And therefore, we needed a lot of qualitative information in order to decide whether, the levy that was introduced in a particular country at a particular time was in fact, an early version of the income tax or not. So this is what we needed qualitative information for. On the other hand, collecting quantitative information is usually a good way to also gather qualitative information because you if you look for, let's say, the date of introduction in a particular country, you get context from legal documents, from the scholarly literature, and you get a lot of ideas and information that you weren't actually looking at, but which in retrospect turns out to be quite useful and important. So I think it's really both ways that this is enriching.
Yeah, certainly. And I think both of you sort of mentioned a little bit earlier on, actually, the one of the spurring reasons for setting out and doing this research was noticing there was such a Western bias in a lot of the data in terms of taxes and policy. To your point, not having appropriate information and data in regards to most of the world's populations, how pervasive is Western bias more generally within economic research, maybe just specifically to relating to tax research and the economic as pertains to that, but honestly, just more in regards to economic research more broadly.
Mhm. Well, maybe first a short disclaimer: we aren't economists, right? So we are
Yeah, sure,
political scientists.
sure, sure.
So just to see, but in general, I would say that there are several Western biases, if you want to think so, and they are pretty severe. So let me talk about two general ones, maybe that we don't see so often,
Sure.
because the bias is not only about who is, what region or which citizens or people are researched on. It's about who is doing the research as well. Mm. So for a handbook on the politics of taxation that I've edited with Lucas Hackerberg, we looked into the most cited articles, right, so on tax policy, and the majority of researchers were first male and second from the, let's say, the global north, right? So OECD countries, the United States, Canada, the UK, Europe. Um, and so those might not, and probably some serve specific departments, right? So this is who gets cited, this is who gets read, um, and so these are the voices that are heard. And those scholars might not necessarily have been born in the West, although they are very likely to be, but they are all at the same institutions in the West. And they decide the research agenda, if you want, right? Because those are the people that, run the big journals and the university presses and that are cited there. And so this leads to a certain bias in who is doing the research. And that, of course, has effects on what type of research is done, both in terms of, groups, effects, taxes that you focus on. So, for instance, what is very typical, because that's the world we live in, we think about taxation as a partisan issue. Right? We think about this as, different classes fighting against each other, left versus right. Right? This
Yeah,
is the main axis that matters for taxation. But this is because that's our politics is structured that way. This is very different in many other countries.
sure. And that's actually something I hadn't necessarily considered. Actually, is a lot, not all, but a lot of the big universities and research institutions that conduct a lot of the research are coming from OECD countries, right? Whether that be America, Germany, the UK, Japan, all these countries. And so it's interesting to hear you say that. I'm curious that in order to gain better quality research that impacts a broader proportion of the population globally, should those institutions look to conduct more field experiments and research within developing or less developed nations in order to round out that kind of research?
Hmm.
Well, there is a whole critique on RCTs in developing countries run by Westerners. But maybe Philip, you want to get into this?
No, no, no. Well, Western science, of course, has this notion of universalism.
Hmm.
And, this assumes, of course, that it doesn't matter so much who does the research. And I find it very interesting because our project is also, of course, a Western project. All participants were from Western countries, most. Yeah. Um, but of course, the book is also read in the non-Western world. So the conception Africans have of, their tax history often comes from the West. So the West defines how non-Western societies think about their own history. Um,
Yeah.
is that a problem? Mm, Yeah, I guess.
Hard to say. You would hope that the research would be impartial or objective as it anyway, so the results would still be manifesting. I suppose ultimately there's always implicit biases that you maybe are able to acknowledge, or things that you won't be able to think of or acknowledge potentially if you don't if you weren't originating from that universities or institutions in that culture.
Well, and then there's the question whether biased research is better than no research.
Yeah.
Because in the West, you have the resources to do this research,
Hmm.
and in other countries, you may not. And of course, we try to be impartial and neutral in everything. There's review processes that are supposed to ensure um, low bias, but there's always bias, and
Yeah.
still, I think you can't beat something with nothing.
Hmm. In regards to, I mean, the data set that you were looking at spanned sort of over 200 countries. Were there any things that you identified that maybe you weren't expecting going in, or to surprise you from the results?
So I guess despite all the differences we've been talking about, there's actually much more similarity. Right? So I also do research on social policy, and for social policy, welfare policies, it's very different. Right? So there you have very different policies around the world. Whereas for taxation, it's really those main tax instruments that almost every country in the world has, that spread very quickly, that did not spread in the way we think about this from, the Brits invented it and then it went everywhere else, right? Actually, it's not even the Brits that invented it. I'm sorry
That's
for
all right.
some of the many of these taxes, right? So also some notions we had where taxes originated were no longer true once we looked at this more clearly, right? If I remember correctly, the Social Security contribution, the first one we have actually is in Bolivia. Mm. So
No,
it's
no, that's the corporate tax.
the
The
corporate
corporate
legacy.
tax was invented in Bolivia.
Ah,
So but it's also not Bismarck, right? Who we Germans usually think of, as the father of the welfare state,
yeah, of
but
course.
it's also and social security contributions who are not a real tax, right? If we want to talk definitions, but we would count as one because they matter so much for state finances. Um, but also that started earlier and somewhere else. So it's not such a Western phenomenon as you would think, and the world is not as divided as you think. So it's much more similarities in tax states than differences, at least when it comes to introduction and timing of it.
Uh, Philip, I guess I'll go to you on this one. In terms of how different types of tax policy, whether that be income taxes, VATs, inheritance, all these different types, was there a difference in terms of the diffusion and an adoption throughout the world in different ways? Were certain taxes sort of increased in different regions or come from different regions and spread differently to others?
No, well, yes. What's interesting to note is that the diffusion of modern taxation was a global process from the very beginning. So in the 19th century, of course, it involved the usual suspects: Great Britain, Prussia, France, etc. But for instance, the personal income tax was introduced in the Dutch West Indies, East Indies in 1839, I think, in India in the 1860s. So global South countries were involved in the introduction of modern taxation from the very beginning. What you see, of course, is that over time, the speed of diffusion has increased. The first tax to be invented, so to speak, the inheritance tax, took a very long time to spread across the world, starting in the 18th century and basically until the mid 20th century. Later taxes like the personal income tax, the corporate income tax, social security contributions, they started to diffuse big time in the 1920s, and basically the wave of introductions was through in the 1970s. And the VAT, the most recent tax, made its entry in the late 1960s, and by the 2010s, basically all countries, more or less worldwide, had introduced it. So
United States, anyone?
there's differences in timing, but what's important to see is that while timing was very similar between Global South and Global North, the mode of introduction was very different. In basically all of sub-Saharan Africa until the 1950s, all modern taxes were introduced under colonial rule, and the same is true for a very high share of countries in Asia.
Sure. Could you expand on that as well? Because that was something I picked up from reading the work, is that there seems to be a difference in the adoption and implementation where taxes have come from colonial rule as opposed to sovereign adoption. Could you expand a little bit more on the impacts of the different mechanisms by which these policies are introduced?
The baseline is the sovereign introduction. And we looked at that, and the story about sovereign introduction is surprisingly similar across the world. So, sovereign introductions are associated with wars, with recessions, um, with democratizations,
Okay.
and with modernization, introduction of the welfare state, etc., even though that's less clear. Now, if you look at colonial introduction, the same factors matter, but it's not the colony's own wars or own recessions or own democratization, but that of the colonial master. So a lot of British and French colonies introduced modern taxes during World War One and World War Two in order to contribute to the war effort of their masters. Also, democratization in the West increased pressure on colonies to become self-financing. As the suffrage spread in Europe, the masses were no longer prepared to pay for colonies that benefited only a very small crust of administrative, military, and economic elites, which increased the pressures on colonies um, to fund their own operation. And that led to tax innovations because colonial rulers were eager to tax the few pockets of economic modernity that they had efficiently. So the harbors, the railways, the companies, large production sites, the mines.
Yeah. And so it sounds as though whether sovereign introduced or colonially introduced, the requisite factors for why they're introduced seem to be the same. It just depends on whether it's the sort of the local population or whether it's the colonial empire problem that's having the problem with it. And it seems as though, you correct me if I'm wrong on this, a lot of these taxes come about, or at least these big shifts in taxes seem to come around from big events, almost like black swan events that sort of come through, whether that be a large war or I don't know, a famine or something where suddenly there is like a big need. And I guess maybe there's also the political capital to be able to sort of, say, oh, okay, well, this is a big problem. We need to be able to, we need a big solution to this problem. Would you say that's a fair assessment? And could you see tax policy changing over time, almost instead of like a gradual upkeep, almost like a staircase of like big events that have increased the taxation to the point globally where we have today?
Well, that's certainly true for introductions because that's a big event, right? Um, there's a so-called ratchet effect, so that means that taxes increase over time in small steps. So that not is not necessarily driven by big events, I would say, but the introduction certainly follows this logic. I just want to get back to the point that it's the same, right? So this is a very different mechanism, if you want, right? Because what the sovereign, introductions do, or what let's say a war does, if your territory is attacked and you have to defend yourself against it, right? This rallies citizens around the tax flag, if you want, right? So this creates taxpayer consent to be taxed
Mhm.
and, administrative capacity to do this, the willingness of citizens to become taxpayers. So that really unites the tax state, if you want. This is also why tax development is very strongly connected with state capacity in and of itself, right? So we often use taxation as a matter to actually measure state capacity of governments all around the world. But this was very different in colonies. And because there the taxation was introduced not, in order to help the colonies, but against that, right? So in colonies, the war happened after the tax introduction, not as a, the tax introduction
Well,
wasn't
right,
following the
yeah,
war,
yeah.
but that was one of the major reasons why local citizens actually went to fight against the colonizers because the taxes were so bad.
Yeah, but it's important to see that these modern taxes, were usually not meant for the indigenous
Yeah,
population. So the income tax was charged on white people living in the colonies. Sometimes it
local
was
elites.
extended to the colonial hinterlands, but then it was usually not levied as an income tax, but as an in-kind tax, often very coercive, often very brutal. So the introduction of modern taxation in the colonies led to a dual tax regime where you had one set of taxes for the urban centers, for the colonizers themselves, and a totally different usually in kind and very coercive system of taxation for the indigenous population. And that was a very bad legacy after independence.
Okay, so it's not just the sort of the colonial settlers, it's also the indigenous populations that are also getting sort of squeezed in terms of these taxes. And from the sounds of it, what you're talking about as well, I mean, the example that crops to mind is the American War for Independence, right? That came about because of, you know, no taxation without, uh, being able to have their voting rights and stuff. And it's the Boston Tea Party and all that kind of stuff, as opposed potentially to, I don't know, increasing taxes in the UK during World War II, where the actual home country is fighting a war on its doorstep. And so you have a sort of rallying effect around higher tax rates, which I think even got up to like sort of 90-95% for
Mhm.
like the higher incomes at that point. So I imagine that also has a massive impact on the actual ease of administration and ability to sort of actually obtain those taxes and then use that to actually use it for public benefit or whatever you're using it for as well, by the sounds of it.
Yeah, and the interesting part is, as I just said, these were so you had these dual tax systems in colonies, right? You had very oppressive taxation, and the funds of these taxes were very often not used to, to defend the colonies or for welfare state, but actually to police them, right? So you had very many reasons not to like these taxes, but still almost every single colony kept these taxes after independence. And that I think again shows just how important these just are as revenue generating mechanisms and policies that, if you are a newly independent country, you really can't afford to not have an efficient tax system to generate government revenue. So we only counted tax introductions in colonial times if they were kept upon independence, right? So if you want to think about this, what the British introduced in by then British India in income tax terms, this legacy is the income tax system that not only India but also Bangladesh and Pakistan's income tax systems today are built upon. This is the long historical legacy. So taxes are much more, stable or persistent than countries, borders,
Uh,
government forms.
Yeah, I think one of the general consensus feelings at the moment, particularly in sort of Western economies, is that the taxation is increasing to the point where, in a lot of instances, depending on the country you're looking at, you're getting up to near sort of 40 to 50% effective tax rates for a big swathe of the population. Is there if What is the trend looking like moving forward? Are we likely to see increasing trends in effective tax rates among Western economies, or is there going to be like a bit of a breaking point within society where there's going to be somewhat of a pushback in terms of the total rates?
Well, first, I would like to push back against what you just said because I don't
Oh,
think
okay,
that's true.
fair enough.
so, so as you said, we had much higher tax rates after the war, so they've
Yeah,
actually
sure.
come down. So tax rates are decreasing, not increasing, especially on wealth and on top income, as well as corporations. What is increasing are consumption tax rates. So value-added taxes, they become increasingly more important also in Western countries. But that just means
Oh,
that,
okay.
different parts of the population or of the income distribution and wealth distribution are taxed differently. And
Mhm.
actually tax systems become less progressive.
That is true, but in revenue terms, you seem to have seen something like growth to a limit. Because since the 1980s, the total tax take in Western countries oscillates around very similar levels. So in France, around 40% and a bit higher. In the United States, between 25 and 30%. But you haven't seen a massive increase in the total tax take since the 1980s.
Interesting. So what would be the cause of that then?
Several factors in the literature, I would say. So so one is this idea that, it is about these big events and it's about this rallying cry. And if you don't have them, so if you have peace, you have all this dividend, then people might not see, especially very wealthy people might not, no longer want to be taxed at such high levels. And that might explain why, income tax levels, inheritance tax levels, wealth tax levels, etc., went down from the 90% to, 40% or so. Um, Another one would be globalization, right? So this is simply a limit of how much even, very strong Western states can tax their citizens if they have the threat to leave, especially if their capital can threat to leave. And then, of course, it might also be that there is some sort of natural ceiling, right, to when it becomes efficient to tax or not.
Well, and then there's access to capital markets.
Yeah.
Yeah, if the tax take hasn't increased dramatically, it has increased, but incrementally over the past decades, the public debt has increased quite significantly. And this is something that a state allows you to do to run a large public debt. And a lot of Western countries have done that. Um, and the problem now increasingly is to fund the debt.
Yeah, certainly. I think that's a problem that I think a lot of the Western countries are coming into at the moment, particularly as we're coming out of this period where we had particularly very, very low interest rates. And I think as interest
Yeah.
rates have sort of crept back up a little bit, suddenly debt payments on government debt is suddenly becoming a higher and higher proportion of the government spending in any given year. I think projections show in a couple of like the UK and the US that some of these debt interest payments are going to sort of increase, blow past some of the biggest sort of department spendings within the countries, whether that be defense or healthcare or what have you. And a lot of attention, I think, recently as a result of that has come about in regards to wealth tax adoption, which is quite it's a bit of a controversial area and seems to have mixed views on its effectiveness for implementation in particular. Um, certain, and I know, I think Switzerland, had versions of it, and some other countries had a sort of mixed effect. Could you provide some insight as to why wealth taxes are, from at least from what it sounds, an interesting tax in terms of actually its ability to be pragmatically effective, and whether it is something, given the things like capital booms and the increasing in economic equality among Western countries, why it either should or shouldn't be potentially considered moving forward for Western economies?
So I think why people focus on this is also because wealth inequality has been increasing, especially in the US. So there is just more to tax, right? There is also more inequality. So, people might see it as fairer to do this. When you think about, or when you speak about wealth taxation, there are different instruments to tax wealth, right? So you can think about, we can tax basically three things. We can tax consumption, we can tax income, and we can tax wealth, right?
Mhm.
So income, that's about the flow, wealth is about the stock, right? So usually people that earn a lot of labor income are also the ones that have more wealth, right? So this is positively correlated. But of course, at some point, you might not have to work anymore. You can just live from your wealth and the income that generates. You can tax it in different ways. The way we have that in our data set is we look at the inheritance tax, right? So this is basically taxing wealth when it is bequested to the next generation. Um, but of course, you can also have a wealth tax proper. This is what I think you were referring to. That taxes, a very small 0 point something percentage of the stock of your wealth every year, not of the increase, but of the stock. You can have property taxes that are usually thought of also doing that, right? Taxing the stock of your earnings, because if they are linked to the value of the property. Um, so Julia Limbeck and me did a study on these wealth tax introductions. And they're actually, we have all these discussions here, but when you look at the data, they are much less wealth taxes and they're much less spread than other forms of taxation. So we only did that for OECD and Latin American countries. But even there, much fewer wealth taxes and inheritance taxes, for instance, and almost nothing if you compare that to VAT or personal income tax, that's everywhere. So it's already much harder to introduce these taxes. They are only introduced when it's a really big hit, like a war or recession. They are not following the standard path of, democratization, modernization. So they're not part of the standard toolkit, I would say. They're really something that you only introduce when there is no other way.
I see.
Um, and then they are not so stable, right? So maybe Philip, you want to talk about our repeal paper.
Uh, well, I would say the equity case for wealth taxation is very easy to make. The problem is that wealth taxes are very cumbersome taxes. So the administration is complex
Hmm.
because before you tax assets, you have to evaluate them.
Right,
You
exactly.
have to assess them. And with liquid assets, if you have an ETF or a savings account, that's easy. But if you have illiquid assets like, real estate or a small business firm, it's very difficult, which is why valuation rules usually differ between asset classes, which is why inheritance taxation and wealth taxation is always vulnerable to legal challenge in the courts because taxpayers say they're treated unfairly, unequally, and usually that's true. A second problem is that of asset rich but income poor taxpayers. So think of a poor pensioner living in a house which now has high market value, or think of a tech startup company that has very high market valuations, but still operates on a loss. They couldn't pay the asset tax. The third problem is the rich have political power, instrumental power. They can lobby governments. They have all the contacts. And they have structural powers. They can say, oh, if you tax us on our wealth, we will go elsewhere. And finally, there's an information problem because the poor often have the wrong perception uh, that wealth taxes, inheritance taxes, will also be on them. And this mix makes it very difficult to introduce these taxes. But, the timing right now may be very good because revenue needs are very high. There's defense, there's demography, there's climate, there's infrastructure. Raising, mass taxes like the VAT, the personal income tax, the social security contributions, that's politically toxic, as you know very well in Britain. And this may create an opening in which resistance to raising wealth taxes is less strong. But if you do it, try to focus on raising the rates of existing wealth taxes. Don't try to introduce anything new. You will get a huge ideological battle.
Sure.
Two short remarks. The poor are 90% of the population or more in this case, right? Because they don't have
Yeah,
any wealth that would be taxed.
yeah,
Um, and so just to be clear.
yeah, yeah.
And the second, I think, an important point that we also forget is that if we don't have wealth taxes, we simply don't even know about wealth, right? So
Hmm.
if you think about the Piketty et al. Large project on measuring inequality, right, in the huge database, the data both on income inequality and on wealth inequality, which is traditionally much harder to measure because it's not so easy to see, right? We can't rely
Hmm.
on surveys. Um, Both come from tax records. So if you
Mhm.
don't have a tax on wealth, you don't actually know whether people have these assets or not. So we actually can't even see how high or low wealth inequality is and whether it's changing in which direction.
Oh, interesting. So, is there a potential then in that regard, just in a hypothetical scenario where you were to introduce a wealth tax? And we've talked a little bit about there on like how you value things, and that brings up a lot of problems. But in an isolated scenario, would actually having a wealth tax potentially give you better information in terms of wealth inequality? Then would it give you better data and better metrics as to how that exists?
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Right? How is data generated at the moment? Right? Most data on income distributions is is based on surveys. So people are simply asked, right? So who answers these surveys, right? Not so many people anyways, but
Yeah.
the wealthy certainly don't. So, you can't use these surveys to estimate the top 1% or also there are also some other issues with some groups, right? For wealth, this problem is much harder because wealth is much more concentrated at the top. So we rely on, other measures, data from banks, some Forbes lists, other things to measure this. And they are not very good data, if you want, right? Not
Hmm.
even for countries where you would expect the data would be good, right? No matter the rest of the world.
I imagine then, because there have been some instances. I think Norway has or had a wealth tax at one point. I think Switzerland as well. Do these countries have better data in regards to the wealth distribution within their countries? Then potentially,
Yeah.
certainly. And when we consider, I mean, we spoke a little bit there about the asset values and things like that, which I think does become a big problem. So much if you own a company, which is a lot, to be honest with you, is a lot of what I would say is like the really high end sort of wealth and stuff. It's usually ownership in a company. Elon Musk's ownership in Tesla and SpaceX is really where a lot of his wealth is coming from. But even in those specific examples, how do you value those things in terms of a wealth tax? Because there is a proportion of that company or stock ownership that is actually quite speculative in terms of its actual value. Because if you just take the stock price potentially of Tesla, it's, for a long period of time, it wasn't even making any money. It wasn't profitable. It was the projection of what we think this is going to be in the future. And so, if that doesn't materialize, then it's going to essentially crash through the floor. And then you're paying taxes on something that is almost like speculative value. That doesn't seem quite right. It seems quite difficult. One of the things I think has been brought up in the UK in regards to this is if you were to increase, and there's different ways you can tax wealth, as you kind of mentioned, whether it's inheritance or uh, net percentages on values and all that kind of stuff. I think something that has been mentioned in the UK, well, I think two things, is one, aligning capital gains taxes with income taxes. So if you're going to, when you sell an asset, you've got a quantifiable value, much easier to administrate taxes at that point in terms of that. And typically, capital gains taxes, at least in the UK, but also some other places, are lower than income taxes. So there's been some talk about aligning those two things so that the income is the same to some degree. And the other thing is in regards to things like reforming things like land value taxes, because again, land, to that point we mentioned earlier about fluctuability, land is much, much less likely, it still could, but like to actually decrease in value. The likelihood is it's actually going to have a steady increase in value over time as compared to, I don't know, a business that could, suddenly have bad management and go wrong. Now, I'm sure there's incidences where land gets, suddenly becomes very, really unpopular because I know you stick an airport next to it or something, I don't know. But the likelihood is a lot less. And so some of the conversation in the UK has been in regards to our local council tax is actually realigning it to be more of a land value tax. And you might think that that's quite sort of out there, but it's actually something that even in the United States, in places like Texas, they actually have quite large land value taxes. So this is even something that within quite a capitalist economy seems to have been implemented to some degree. Would you say that those things are much more likely to be successful than just say putting 0.5% or 1% on general wealth of people over 10 million a year, as some people have potentially suggested?
Well, it's definitely an easier tax handle because it's easier to observe and I guess also to assess. And therefore, I think if you want to tax capital, that's a very useful first step to take. Secondly, I think because, as you said, it's so difficult to assess the value of financial assets, a good way to tap into some of the wealth is by simply having a good corporate tax,
Hmm.
because the very high incomes, and they either own companies or they own shares in companies.
Hmm.
And therefore, by taxing companies, you tap into some of their wealth. And this is why, the downward trend in corporate taxation is really problematic for the entire tax progressivity, because a corporate tax is really the baseline for the taxation of capital.
Yeah, no, I see. So, just as a rounding off question, as we sort of bring this conversation to a close, I'm really interested to hear what each of you has in terms of your answers on this. But what piece of future research do you think could best capitalize upon the work that you've done in these
Mm.
instances around this work? What piece of research, in your own opinions, think could capitalize best on it to sort of bring more insight into the future in terms of how we look at taxation and policies across the globe?
So I think before I delve into that, what I really wanted to say is here. So I would like to invite everyone to actually use our data and use it, because if you want, that's the beauty of open data, and this is also one of our goals, and this is also why we made it public even before we published it, why we have both quantitative and qualitative information. Because I mean, there are many ways that I can think, and I want to work on this further. But what I really want is, because this is also something that spans so many disciplines, right? From historic, historical studies, economic history, sociology, political science, right? Law. So there will be very many things that I can't even think of, where other scholars might find this data useful, and I hope that this will happen. Then where would I like to go next? Um, so what we have done so far, I think we have explored the drivers of the introduction of these taxes, right? And there are some obvious things that we haven't fully looked at. You could do so: timing, spreading, sequencing of these taxes. Um, but what I would really like to go next and see is what the impact of these introductions are,
Mm.
especially the difference between coercive introductions, as in the colonial context, versus the sovereign introductions in other countries, and whether this makes a big difference for the tech state and tech society afterwards.
Well, the reason why we started the project was to eventually arrive at a global history of the state.
Mm.
And we now mapped the introduction of these foundational taxes, and we looked at correlates of these introductions. But what's still missing is, a history, the global history that's behind all this. Because what I find very interesting is the synchronicity in state development in very, very different parts of the world. If you think about high modernity of the, let's say, 1970s, that had left an imprint on the state in the West, but also very strongly on newly independent states in the global South. And I think our data could form a basis, and especially the qualitative information that we gathered in the context of collecting the data for telling this uh, global story of the state
No,
rather than just a narrow, France
yeah, so
versus
no, I think
Britain.
it's incredibly interesting. So yeah, thank you both for your time, Laura and Philip. I really do appreciate it. Is there any other pieces of research other than the works that we've talked about today you would like to point people to?
Mm. So, Laura, well, we have our papers.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we also work on more narrow things at home, right? So we work on surveys and survey experiments on introducing green taxes, right? And what drives opposition to that. So carbon taxation, that's what we're both working on. I also work now more on gender taxation. So why some countries discriminate and against women in their tax system and why they reform and others don't.
Hmm.
So that's again, part of this. We only so the I guess my idea here is that, who the researcher is determines what they research on, right? So that
Hmm.
doesn't mean that the research is biased, but that just what they focus on is so this is taxation is very male. Not only very Western, it's also very male, and not very many people have looked at this. So I'm interested in seeing what's driving this.
Cool.
Yeah, we also have a paper on the repeal of
Yeah.
inheritance taxes because it's very interesting to see. Usually, these modern taxes are very stable.
Mm.
You introduce personal income tax, you keep it. There are very, very, very few cases of states ever abolishing a personal income tax, a corporate income tax, social security contributions, or VAT.
Hmm.
But the inheritance tax has been repealed in very many countries, both in the global north and the global south. And we looked into this. And, the key explanation is inheritance taxes are always politically contested because they're clear winners and losers. There are those who have to pay and those who potentially gain. That makes them contentious. As long as the government needs inheritance taxes to balance the books, this distributive conflict is secondary.
Hmm.
But as these other modern taxes develop a revenue raising potential, you governments depend less and less on the revenue generated by wealth taxation. And so this contestation around distributive conflict comes to the fore and makes these taxes very vulnerable um, uh, 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 to repeal.
Hmm.
The good news is repeal risks are still lower in democracies than in autocracies.
Uh,
So democracies may not protect the median voter as you would like to see it in an ideal world, but they offer comparatively better protection than the alternatives.
I see. No, I think that's very interesting. Actually, something I'll probably go want to go dive into myself actually as well. There's some interesting nuances there. Laura, Philip, thank you very much for your time. Thank you everyone for watching, and hopefully we'll speak soon.
Bye, Max.
Thank you for having us.